The note said, in thick black marker, "Nitrogen monoxide wants children." Thomas saw it before he really understood it. 3 blunt words scrawled across a piece of cardboard, propped against an old park bench like a warning, like a verdict. He was halfway past the frozen fountain when his feet slowed on their own, his body registering something wrong before his mind caught up. The snow had been falling since dusk, not in delicate flakes, but in dense, hushed sheets that turned the city into a world made of muffled edges. Street lamps glowed in amber halos. The paths were nearly deserted. Even the distant traffic on the main road sounded softened, as if wrapped in cotton. Thomas pulled his coat tighter and angled his head down against the wind. His shift at St. Bridget's had run long again, and the exhaustion sat in his bones like wet cement. 12 hours of alarms and crying and the sharp, antiseptic sting of loss. He'd held a teenager's hand while a mother begged a god Thomas didn't believe in. He'd watched a man's chest rise and fall to a machine's rhythm long after the man himself had left. He'd argued with a resident about an order, then apologized, then gone to the supply closet and pressed his forehead to the shelves, until the urge to scream passed. All he wanted now was his tiny studio apartment, his stale takeout, his bed. And then he saw them, 2 small figures, huddled together on the bench near the fountain. So still they might have been carved from the ice. At first his tired brain tried to file them away as something else: lost hats, bundled coats, a pair of discarded dolls. The park played tricks in the snowlight. Everything looked softened, incomplete. But then one figure shifted the smallest fraction, a tremor rather than movement, and Thomas's heart lurched hard enough to steal his breath. Children, 2 little girls, 6, maybe 7, sitting alone in the freezing night. "Oh my God," he whispered, and his feet were already moving, his medical training snapping into place like a reflex. Hypothermia, frostbite, exposure. Call for help. Get them warm. Assess breathing, pulse, responsiveness. But as he closed the distance, the world did something strange. The girls weren't pale with cold. They weren't the mottled, waxy color he'd seen a dozen times in the ER on nights when the shelters overflowed and someone slipped through the cracks. They were blue, not the bluish tinge of a body fighting to keep blood in its core, not the purplish bruising of skin starved for oxygen. Blue as a winter sky right before night falls, blue as glacier ice, a deep, luminous shade that looked less like skin and more like something lit from within. Thomas stopped short, the snow squeaking beneath his boots. The girls sat pressed together, arms locked around each other's shoulders in a grip that looked equal parts protection and desperation. Their clothes were thin tattered leggings, a too small sweater, a frayed dress with no coat over it. The kind of clothing that wouldn't last 10 minutes in weather like this. Their hair, too, seemed wrong in a way that made his scalp prickle. One had long auburn hair that spilled down her back in a tangled curtain. The other's curls were shorter, darker, and caught the streetlight in odd glints like frost. Their eyes were open, too open, large and luminous, staring into the space ahead as if the world had already moved past them, as if they were waiting for permission to vanish. Thomas's chest tightened painfully. "Hey," he said, softer now, as if loudness might shatter them. He crouched in front of the bench, his knees sinking into the drift. The coal seeped immediately through the fabric of his pants, but he barely noticed. "Sweethearts, can you hear me?" No response, no blink. Snow collected on their shoulders and hair, dotting them in white. Their lips were a darker shade of blue, almost violet. Their fingers bare, unbelievably bare, were curled tight into the fabric of each other's sleeves. Thomas reached out, then hesitated with his hand hovering inches away. A ridiculous thought flashing through him. What if they aren't real? He touched the nearest girl's forearm. Solid, cold. Not just cold like skin exposed to air, cold like metal left outside overnight. Cold like something that belonged to winter itself. He pulled in a sharp breath and fumbled for his phone with stiff fingers. 911. Ambulance. Police. Social services. He could do it in seconds. His thumb hovered over the screen, and then he saw the cardboard again. No one's children. The letters were uneven, as if written in anger or haste. The edges of the sign were damp, curling slightly. It had been placed carefully, leaned against the bench so any passerby would see. A declaration. Thomas's throat went tight. What would he even say? "I found two blue-skinned children in the park." The dispatcher would think he was delirious from exhaustion or high or cruelly prank-calling. If an ambulance came, the EMTs would do what they were trained to do: strip them, measure them, jab them with needles, speak over their heads. And if police came first? If they saw two children who looked like this? He imagined questions that weren't kind. He imagined the girls being taken somewhere bright and sterile, being treated like a puzzle, being treated like a specimen. Thomas looked at their faces, small cheeks already rimed with ice, lashes dusted white, and felt something inside him crack open with a soundless, helpless grief. They were alone. The sign made that brutally clear. Someone had decided they didn't belong to anyone. Someone had decided that was permission to leave them here, on a bench, in the snow, to become part of the winter. "No," he said, the word coming out like a vow. "No, that's not true." His hands moved before his fear could catch up. He shrugged off his coat, his only real barrier against the cold, and draped it over both girls, wrapping the fabric around their thin shoulders. He tucked it in close like he'd do with a patient blanket, sealing in whatever warmth he could offer. Their bodies were light, too light, as if hunger and cold had eaten them from the inside out. He slid an arm behind their backs and lifted them together. They didn't protest. Their heads lolled against his chest, and the cold radiating from them pressed through his sweater like a second skin. As he adjusted his grip, one girl's long auburn hair made a small sound. Not a cry, not even a whimper, more like the faint creak of ice beginning to shift. Thomas swallowed hard. "I've got you," he murmured. "You're safe, I promise." He didn't know if he could promise that. He didn't know if safety was something the world could offer girls like this. But he promised anyway. The walk to his apartment was only 10 minutes. But with two children in his arms and snow thickening around him, it felt endless. His shoulders burned. His fingers went numb. The girls remained limp against him. Their faces turned inward as if they'd learned not to look at the world too long. Thomas kept talking because silence felt dangerous. "You're okay," he said, breath fogging in front of his mouth. "We're almost there. Just hold on. I'm Thomas. My name is Thomas. You don't have to answer, okay? Just stay with me." The city around him was quiet in the way it got after midnight, snow windows dark, sidewalks erased. Once, a car passed at the far end of the street, tires hissing softly through slush. Thomas didn't stop. He hugged the girls closer, trying to shield them with his own warmth, as if he could brute force life back into them. By the time he reached his building, his arms were shaking. He fumbled with the key, half panicked at the thought of dropping them. The lobby smelled like old mail and radiator heat. The warmth hit him like a wave, and he almost sagged with relief. Up the narrow stairwell, past peeling paint and a neighbor's door decorated with a crooked wreath, he reached his studio on the 3rd floor. He pushed inside with his shoulder. His apartment was small and cluttered. A single room split into zones by furniture, a kitchenette with a sink full of dishes, a narrow bed shoved against the wall, a second-hand couch, stacks of medical journals and laundry threatening to become one with the floor. It smelled like coffee and antiseptic and the faint, persistent loneliness of a person who spent most nights at a hospital. But it was warm. Thomas kicked the door shut, crossed the room, and laid the girls on his bed as gently as if they were made of glass. The sheets were rumpled from the morning he'd left in a hurry. He didn't care. He grabbed every blanket he owned, to old quilts, a fleece throw, a heavy comforter, and piled them over the girls until only their faces peeked out. Their skin was still that impossible blue, but under the lamplight it had depth, like pigment layered over starlight. Their breaths were so shallow he had to lean close to be sure they were breathing at all. His hands shook as he turned the heater knob up until it clicked to its highest setting. "Okay," he said to himself, voice rough. "Okay, Thomas. Warmth first. Slow warmth. Don't shock the system." He moved into the kitchenette and filled his kettle, forcing himself into the familiar rhythm of care. He could do this. He'd done this 100 times. Just not like this. He rummaged through his cabinets. Milk, honey, a clean mug, well, cleanish. He washed 2 mugs quickly, his fingers clumsy. While the kettle heated, he watched the bed. The girls hadn't moved. Their eyes were still open, unfocused, as if they were looking through the ceiling into some far place Thomas couldn't follow. "What happened to you?" he wondered. "Who left you there?" The sign's words flashed in his mind again, cruel and casual. "No one's children." Thomas swallowed against the sudden sting behind his eyes. When the kettle whistled, he poured hot water into a bowl, set it aside to cool slightly, then warmed the milk on the stove the way his mother used to when he was small and sick. Honey melted into it in slow golden ribbons. The sweet smell filled the apartment, softening the air. He carried the mugs back to the bed carefully and sat on the edge, leaving space between them like a respect he wasn't sure how to name. "Hi," he said again, quieter. "I made something warm. Can you drink a little? It'll help." He slid a pillow behind the nearer girl's shorter hair, dark curls, and lifted her carefully into a more upright position. She was so light his arms felt hollow. He brought the mug to her lips. For a long moment, nothing happened. Thomas waited, holding his breath, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios. If they couldn't swallow, if their airway reflex was compromised, if they aspirated, then, so slowly he almost missed it. Her lips parted. She took a sip, a tiny swallow, delicate and cautious. Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "That's it," he whispered. "That's perfect. Just a little." He turned to the other girl, the one with the auburn hair, and offered her the second mug. She watched it for a beat, eyes unfocused, then leaned forward slightly and drank. Her hands rose, trembling, to cup the mug's warmth as if she recognized it as something precious. As they drank, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden color change. No miraculous transformation. Just life returning in the smallest ways. A blink. A slight tightening of fingers on the blankets. The softening of that vacant stare into awareness. Their skin remained blue, but now there was a hint of warmth under it, like dawn pressing faintly through cloud. The girl with dark curls looked at Thomas. Really looked. Her eyes were large and pale, with flecks that glittered like powdered ice. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Strangely melodic, as if her words were part of a song she'd learned long ago. "You saw us," she said. Thomas swallowed. "Yeah." Her gaze flicked to the window, where snow still fell in thick curtains beyond the glass. "We thought we would disappear," she said, the words soft and steady as if she'd rehearsed them. "We thought. That's what happens when no one keeps you." The auburn-haired girl nodded, her lips pressing together. When she spoke, her voice was the same quiet music, but threaded with something like disbelief. Like we were never here at all. Thomas felt his chest ache. He set the mugs on his nightstand with deliberate care, then placed his hands flat on his knees to keep them from reaching too quickly, too abruptly. "What are your names?" he asked. The auburn-haired girl hesitated, then said, "Lyra." The other followed a beat later. "Nova." "Lyra," Thomas repeated softly, as if saying it carefully made it safer. "Nova." They watched him, waiting. "My name's Thomas," he said. He tried a smile. It felt fragile on his face. I'm glad you're here." Nova's brows drew together slightly. "Glad?" Thomas nodded, throat thick. "Yes." Lyra's gaze drifted toward the edge of the bed, toward the pile of blankets, then back to him. Her eyes shone with something that might have been tears, except when they gathered at the corners. They caught the light like silver. Thomas's heart stumbled. He reached out slowly, palms up, giving them the choice. "Can I?" he asked. Nova looked at Lyra. Lyra gave the smallest nod. Thomas took their hands, one in each of his. Their fingers were still cold, but not the dead cold of the park. Now it was like holding a stone that had been left in winter, but brought indoors a cold that could be coaxed away. "I need you to know something," Thomas said. He glanced toward the door, as if the sign's words might have followed them in. That note, the one in the park, it was wrong. Nova stared at him. It said the truth. It said what someone wanted to be true. Thomas corrected gently. There's a difference. Lyra's lips trembled. No one wanted us. The words were so simple, so old. Thomas felt anger flare in him, sudden and sharp, hot enough to shock him awake. Anger at the faceless person who'd written those words, who'd left to children in the snow like garbage. Anger at a world that could look at difference and decide it meant disposable. He held their hands tighter, careful not to hurt them. "You are not no one's children," he said, voice steadying as he spoke. "You are not something to be thrown away. You're not a mistake the world gets to erase." Lyra's silver tears spilled over, sliding down her blue cheeks like tiny moons. "We're different," she whispered. "People look at us and they don't see girls." Nova's jaw clenched. She was young, but Thomas recognized that expression, the protective anger of someone who'd learned to fight with. Her face because she couldn't afford to fight with anything else. Thomas leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if telling them a secret. "Different doesn't mean less," he said. "It doesn't mean unwanted. It just means you're you, and you deserve a place where being you is safe." Nova's eyes searched his face like she expected the lie to show itself. Lyra's voice was almost soundless. "You mean it?" Thomas didn't look away. "I mean it." Nova's breath hitched, even though she gestured vaguely toward her own skin, toward the impossible color of her hands in his. "Even though this," Thomas gave a small, fierce nod. "Especially because of that," he said. "I don't know what you are. I don't know where you came from, but I know what you are right now." Nova's lips parted. "Children," Thomas finished, "cold and scared and left behind. And I'm a man who walked past too much suffering today. I'm not walking past you for a moment." The room was quiet except for the heater clicking as it strained, and the distant hush of snow against the window. Then Nova moved. She launched herself forward with surprising strength, wrapping her thin arms around Thomas's neck. The impact knocked a breath from him. Her body was still cold, but the cold was fading, retreating inch by inch under the blankets and the warm air and the simple, fierce fact of being held. Thomas's arms came up automatically, circling her, bracing her against him. A heartbeat later, Lyra followed, climbing into the embrace like she was afraid of being left out of it. Afraid the warmth might disappear if she didn't claim it quickly. She pressed her face against Thomas's shoulder, her silver tears dampening his sweater. Thomas held them both, his chin resting briefly on Lyra's hair. He could feel them shaking not from the cold now, but from something deeper releasing. Fear, grief, relief so intense it had to come out through the body, because the mind couldn't hold it all. He closed his eyes. He didn't know what tomorrow would look like. He didn't know how to explain to blue-skinned girls, to landlords and doctors and co-workers, and a system that loved paperwork more than people. He didn't know what it meant to keep them safe in a world that stared. But he knew this right now. In this small room where warmth and honeyed milk and blankets made a fragile fortress. Against the winter, they belonged. And maybe so did he. "You're mine now," he whispered into their hair. Nova stiffened just a little, as if the words were too big, too dangerous to accept. Thomas added quickly, voice breaking, not in a taking way, in a choosing way, in a you don't have to be alone ever again way. Nova's grip tightened. Lyra's trembling eased, fraction by fraction. "And I'm yours," Thomas whispered, "if you'll have me." Nova pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes shining. "Family," she said, like the word tasted unfamiliar. Thomas nodded. "Family," he said simply. "Not because of blood, not because someone wrote your name on a form. Because I'm here, and you're here, and I choose you, and you can choose me back." Lyra's silver tears gathered again, but this time her expression wasn't hollow. It was tentative, like someone reaching for a light they'd forgotten existed. Outside the window, the snow kept falling, burying the city in white. Somewhere below, a car crawled past, tires whispering through slush. The world went on, indifferent and vast. Inside the studio, 3 bodies huddled together beneath a heap of blankets, sharing warmth, sharing breath, sharing the newly terrifying possibility of hope. Thomas rocked them gently, a slow sway the way he'd seen mothers do in the pediatric wing. He didn't have practice at it, not really, but his body seemed to understand what his mind was still trying to catch up to. "Hold, protect, stay." His voice came out rough and soft. "You won't be left in the cold again," he said. "Not while I can help it." Nova buried her face in his shoulder again. Lyra's fingers curled around the fabric of his sweater, like she was anchoring herself to something real. And in the quiet, Thomas felt the weight of the day of the hospital, of the losses, of the endless parade of suffering shift slightly, making room for something else. Not an answer, not a miracle, a choice. Outside, in the park, the cardboard sign lay abandoned in the snow, its cruel words already disappearing under the falling white, buried and forgotten, as if the night itself refused to let that message stand. Inside, under blankets and lamplight, Thomas held the girls as if he'd been meant to all along. No one's children. Not anymore. They were his now, and he was theirs. Whatever came next, questions, fear, paperwork, stares. Nights when the world felt too sharp, he would face it with them. He would learn how to be the kind of person who could keep a promise like this. He would make room in his life, in his home, in his heart. Because family, Thomas realized, wasn't a thing you inherited by accident. Sometimes it was a thing you built on purpose. Sometimes it was looking at someone the world had overlooked and saying, with everything you had, "You matter, you belong."